Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel BethChatsBooks. So it has been a little bit of a while since I've checked in with you guys. It has been very hectic here at home. So we've had builders in for many weeks now. So it's a bit of a mess behind me. Half of this room, it's had the carpets pulled up. We're having some work done behind here. So my book trolleys have been pushed here. I don't have much floor space at the moment down here. Very compact in here. That's the sound of books falling over as well. They're just spilling out of all areas of this room. They're literally just crashing now on the side, but I'm going to ignore that. And so I've not been able to film here very recently because the builders are in every single day. I've started volunteering, so that's on a Tuesday, so that's my only day off is now taken up with leaving the house and going to the courts and back. So I haven't had any time to film then. I'm currently on a break from my uni work, but that starts again at the end of this month. So then any other time will be taken up with doing studying and project work for that module when that starts again at the end of this month. So I've been trying to squeeze in a lot of reading. I have a huge NetGalley TBR that I wanted to get through, and I've taken some books out of the library. But I tried sporadically to try and film when I've had free time, but on the weekend everybody's in. So that's hard work, and occasionally I have Thursdays off, but again builders have been in all day, so going downstairs and trying to film in the living room, which is another room I use frequently, has not worked out either because you can hear banging. I think in a couple of other videos I've done you've heard banging. So it's late at night now, it's about 9:30, and I've switched the main light off and put a side lamp on, and I don't think the quality is horrendous, so I think now is my best shot at filming and wrapping up some of the books that I've read recently, because some of the family members are still watching TV downstairs and the loud ones haven't come back from the pub yet. So fingers crossed that you won't be able to hear other people banging around. You might shortly hear banging around outside here because we have a landing, and my room's quite near to the bathroom, and I have loud family members, so what are you going to do? But without further ado, I think we should get into this wrap up. So the last book that I talked about with you guys was Consent by Vanessa Springora, and since then I went on to read Transcendent Kingdom by Yassi, or Jassy. I don't know how people pronounce it. People pronounce it slightly differently. And I was given the NetGalley proof of this a while back, but it did take me a while to get round to it. I'm a terrible NetGalley person. I get really excited, request a lot, get very excited about that, and then sometimes I do miss the dates. I've been quite good. Some of the ones that I have published, I have had reminders to come back to it when it's released, so that's great. But obviously this has come out by now, so you guys have probably heard a lot about it. It has ended up on the Women's Prize for Fiction. Has it landed on the shortlist? Let me check. I've been looking at a lot of book lists at the moment, so I've got myself really confused what books are on what lists anymore. So I'm just going to look. Yes, it has. I think for some reason with the Women's Prize for Fiction this year, I already preempted a lot of the titles that ended up on it, so I kind of confused myself whether I'd made it up or they actually were on the list, but Transcendent Kingdom by Yassi was actually on the list. So this is a bit of a departure from Homegoing, which was her first novel, which kind of dealt with two linear timelines that traversed different countries, and it was kind of a family tree and how they split up these sisters and lived different lives, and then the intergenerations and the growth of their family tree. That I'm absolutely butchering that, but it was quite interesting. It dealt with a lot of different generations, a lot of characters in these two parallel timelines, which was really, really interesting, and it took us from Africa to America. And this book is focused in America, and it follows Gifty, who she is a scientist. She works in a lab and they work on brain activity in rats, and she ends up having her mother come to stay, and she reflects on her mother's two main incidents of what we would call mental breakdown. And her mother seems to be going through a period of depression when she comes to stay, and she's rarely leaving her bedroom. And I listened to a podcast quite recently in which the author spoke about this book and how it was a bit of a challenge to write about Gifty's mother, because majority of the novel, Gifty's mother doesn't leave a bed, and she's not really vocal. She doesn't vocalise her feelings. Gifty is projecting a lot of her thoughts about her mother onto us as a reader of what she's thinking, but Gifty's mother rarely speaks. So Yaa Gyasi is such a talented author, and I really think that this was a step up from Homegoing. A lot of people think Homegoing was better, but I think this was a much more finely crafted novel. It was shorter. We weren't going heavy with plot or heavy with landscape. It was about an intimate relationship really between Gifty and her mother, between Gifty and religion and Gifty and science. So it was a lot more of a closed off novel in some ways and very intimate, but the writing was so impressive that you can kind of see the author honing their skill set in this novel, I think, more than in Homegoing. Even though Homegoing in some ways was a more impressive feat of what she managed to achieve in the novel form. But I found this very, very impressive. So I've given it 4 out of 5 stars. I think there are probably hundreds of more insightful reviews on the internet in general about this book. But I was very happy to see it go on the shortlist, because I did actually see Eric and Anna's prediction video for the Women's Prize, and then I did see their reaction video. So I subconsciously already knew this was on the list, but obviously I had to just check a minute ago. But I remember being happy because I really wanted this and The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett to definitely get on it, and for Luster to not. And those 3 things happened, so I was pretty happy with that. But that is Transcendent Kingdom for you guys. So I'm just going to keep glancing down at my Goodreads, because I have no idea, sometimes because such a long time elapses before I do these videos, I really struggle to remember which books I've talked with you guys about and which I haven't. So it's always a bit of a surprise for me as well. So the next one I read was Madame by Phoebe Wynne, and this was also a NetGalley proof. On paper, this sounds like something that I would love. It's set in a boarding school in rural Scotland, out of the way. And the main protagonist is a teacher who's invited to the boarding school, and it all seems a bit strange. She's invited out the blue. She obviously has an interview, and her mother's very poorly. And it's a very prestigious school, and somebody who worked at the school with her recommended her. But it seems crazy that she got the job, and then when she gets to this prestigious school, things start happening which are a little bit peculiar, and this lady is a little bit confused. They keep alluding to the previous teacher and the position that she's taken, who used to have the position as the classics teacher at the school. And there is a lot of alluding to an incident that happened the year before. Now, this school has never recruited externally, as far as she's aware, for a very, very, very long time, or if ever. There's always this assumption that she's the very first to be picked externally. And obviously it raises a lot of questions. Why? And things start to get a little bit seedy and a bit weird. So on paper, this really sounded like something that I would love. I think the first chapter really got me intrigued because it starts with an incident that really ends the novel, but you don't know what's happened. And I like those novels where we're introduced to something that's going to happen quite early on in the novel, and then we have to backtrack to how did we get to that final moment in time and do that full circle moment. But I had a few niggles with this book. One of the main issues I had was pacing of this novel. I found that some bits were quite rushed, the ending felt quite rushed, but the main meat of the story was going at a snail's pace. We were alluding to things for a very long time, but the actual plot wasn't developing, so I kind of felt the last 15-20% of the novel threw a lot of things at us, and it didn't really give me the gratification I was looking for, considering I'd invested so much time in the earlier chunk of the novel that was a little bit dull. I think if you're going to do a boarding school story, you need to condense it right down. We need to get the reveals at the right time to keep the audience interested and entertained, because those kind of novels already have a kind of built-in plot device to them, really. And a boarding school and a thriller, the kind of tropes lend itself to keeping that plot churning. And if you give us a lot of like what I call fluff in the middle and then try to throw the thriller at the end, it doesn't feel like you executed your plot very well. It kind of felt like a lot of the beliefs were very archaic, and it didn't seem very plausible for that kind of world to be in correlation with the 1990s UK experience. A lot of the characters were very whiny, and the dystopian world building of that isolated boarding house felt very artificial in points, and they were trying to force things that just didn't click with me at some points. So I ended up giving this book around 2.5 stars, to be honest, because it didn't even lend itself to what I would call a solid 3-star rating. It just, more things irked me than I enjoyed. I gave Transcendent Kingdom 4 out of 5 stars. I don't know if I just said that before. And then moving forward, I read the first book in the Peter James Roy Grace series, which is Dead Simple. And this is a really interesting setup, actually. Considering this book was the early noughties, I actually think the thriller, crime, mystery, police procedural setup was very intriguing. So it kind of starts off with a stag do that goes wrong, and there's a prank that goes wrong. But I think the thriller was still very tightly woven. I didn't see where it was going to go in the end. I think the character development was very good. I think the main protagonist, Roy Grace, is a very competent character. He has echoes of a lot of British police procedural detectives or protagonists, like Cormoran Strike, like with the Tony Parsons series, like with Inspector Morse. They're very eccentric characters, and I got into that comfort zone of the style very quickly. I find these kind of quintessentially British police procedural type stories comforting, even though obviously the thriller in it, or the murders or the crimes, can be quite distressing. I don't want to say comforting, I say it loosely, but that world of the beer drinking, chain smoking police protagonist, I do find them comforting and fun. It was very, very good. I think it was really strong. I would continue with the series, even though I think there's about 13 or 14. I might pick it up at some stage, but I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I did enjoy it. Then I read London Burning by Anthony Quinn. So Secret Readers gave me a free ebook of this to read. So Secret Readers is a app Hatchet, the publishers do, and I think it's a new scheme. It's to encourage people to read and review ebooks early. So they had an April selection of ebooks, and you're allowed to select one, and then obviously the expectation was to read it and do a review. So I picked London Burning, and this was set in the 1970s, and it has a conglomeration of 3 or 4 characters that interweave. We have a very camp theatrical theatre director for a big London theatre company who is cheating on his wife and with the up-and-coming actress. And we have a female police officer, a female journalist, and we have an Irish university lecturer who in the 70s gets accused of helping the IRA. He has a friend who comes to visit him and finds out that he was involved in IRA activities, and he gets linked falsely. And all of these four characters kind of converge at different points. I thought this plot was very, very clever, actually. I think when you juggle so many plates as a novelist, you have to be quite confident that it's going to work. I did feel quite early on in this book that I was in safe hands. I don't think the interactions between the four of them, when they did converge, were particularly artificial or stilted. I think it worked. It wasn't hinging heavily on that coincidence element that some people can find a bit farcical or a bit too forced. It has a lot of really interesting themes that I really enjoyed. I like this period of time historically as dealing with trade union strikes, and how the bins are piling up in London due to the bin men strikes. I was talking about the politics in the background with the rise of Thatcher and Thatcher coming into power. It was dealing with the British, particularly the English relationship to Ireland and the IRA, and the tensions with the bombings in London, and a whole host of really interesting topics that were addressed in a very engaging way. This didn't feel like it was throwing a lot of information. It wasn't boring. The plot kept developing at a really steady pace. So I found it really quick and easy to get through, to be honest, and quite a pleasurable reading experience. I was very happy with the service that the app was giving me, the Secret Readers, and I believe they've got a new selection in June again. So I'll be happy to use that service again, and I think the author did a really good job. I gave that a solid 4 out of 5 stars. I really found that a fun, enjoyable read. So then the next book that I read was When the Dogs Don't Bark by Professor Angela Gallup. My dad gave me this book ages ago and I just never got round to reading it. So Angela Gallup is a forensic scientist, and she has helped work on a lot of really infamous UK criminal cases. For example, Stephen Lawrence. She's reviewed forensic evidence from the Jamie Bulger killers, the Pembrokeshire murders, and a whole host of other notorious crimes. So this book is really interesting because it fills in a gap in the market for this type of non-fiction, because it's not focused on pathology and the clues from the body, and I think a lot of other pathologists, forensic scientists are looking at that. This book really looks at what forensic science as a field is, the different kinds of forensic science, and how useful they are in certain cases. So, for example, those who are specialists in DNA extraction from hair samples, for example, or those who get forensic biologists who maybe analyse samples like blood deposits or semen samples, or forensic biologists who are involved in the kind of specialisation of insect life on decomposition. A bit of a gruesome job, but scientists that can determine how long has been dead for in an area, or which kind of location they were killed in, based on the kind of insect activity, whether there has been eggs laid in a body or flies, and being able to determine whether they were left in the open, whether they were left in the damp, whether it's been a couple of days since death. And she kind of goes through all these different elements and how forensic science isn't just what it's perceived as being, which I think is predominantly a pathologist kind of look, and looking at the crime scene or looking directly at the body to find evidence. Loathing is a really important thing, and how she goes into a lot of detail about how testing and how the standards of testing need to be kept up, and how if people can't understand the data that they're collating from collection, how it does a disservice to the criminal investigation, because people can make assumptions about evidence they found that in the context isn't true or doesn't make sense. So I thought that was really interesting. For a lot of people, I think this book would be classed as more dry, because it's her justification of how we need to be really clear on the research, and we need to do the research properly so that we don't give misinformation, and all the different areas of forensic science and their importance, and kind of her life's work, the companies that she set up and the dedication that she's done and her contributions to the field. So I found it really, really interesting, and I think it's a great addition to this type of non-fiction. So I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. I think it was really, really good. I know that some of the reviews on Goodreads have mentioned that this book was a bit dry, and it isn't an in-depth non-fiction looking at these individual cases and what happened. It's really very much from her area of expertise, and her level of excitement is finding the right blood deposit, as opposed to how the killer committed the crime. So if you're looking for those kind of non-fictions, this book isn't that, but very solid, very informative. I found it really, really interesting. Then I read Daddy by Emma Cline. Emma Cline is more famous in the book world for her first novel that came out, which was The Girls, which was a fiction loosely based on the Manson cult. And this is a series of short stories focused around, I got the impression it was around men and the abuses of power, but it's not exclusively those kind of stories. It's a mixture of relationships between people and power dynamics and the darker side of relationships. So I found this collection very, very captivating. I loved all of the stories. And for me, I mentioned this previously, but with short stories, if I enjoy all of them, it's going to get quite a high rating from me, because I think it's very hard to get somebody to enjoy every single one of them. Just remember just thinking these are really strong stories, and they did have this darker element to them. That's what I would say. They're not overtly shock factor dark, but they have this subtle darkness that when you finish reading them, you kind of feel a little bit unnerved, because they're not given in an overt way. So it's almost like this sneaky build up that when you finish reading it, you feel a little bit, afterwards, like you kind of finish them and feel like it didn't slap you across the face, but it did it in the right tone for you to ponder them afterwards. So in particular, the last story kind of deals with this very frustrating female protagonist. She is in an institution, a bit like a rehab centre, but it seems to be a lot more glamorous. And we're never really told what she's in there for, but then we were told that she had an interest before she came into the rehab facility of being on the internet and pretending to be an underage girl and reaching out to men, obviously very insidious, disgusting men who seem to think that underage women are attractive, and she was posing for pictures and she was sending them pretending to be underage, and they were saying derogatory things to her, and then she would go on different platforms and pretend that she was one of those men and speak to the other men about it. A whole description of that was just so uncomfortable to read about. And then she goes to this facility and a man comes along and kind of heavily references a figure that to me, the character that popped out most in my head was kind of a Weinstein character. Somebody that's quite famous, a director, producer, by the way she described him on red carpets with young actresses. It seemed very similar. And how this person also was on trial potentially for sexual assault or sexual abuse. So it lent itself, and the description from Emma was very much an overweight, pathetic looking human. And so that story really vividly stuck out in my mind because it was just dark. This main protagonist was getting a kick out of playing with him while she was there as well. So it's this subtle, dark place that she goes to, but not in a grotesque way, is the best way to describe it. In a stealthy way. That kind of afterwards you sit there and think, oh, no, that wasn't right. Then some of the stories are a lot more subtle. For example, there is a father that goes to his son's university to collect him, and we have been alluded to the fact that a violent incident has happened between him and somebody else, and he is suspended. And the end of the story hinges on the father sat with the son and the son's girlfriend, and they're antagonising the father, they're being rude, they're having no kind of concept of the fact that his dad's saved his arse and he's going to solve everything for him and he'll be on the suspension, but it'll all work out because daddy's got money. And they manipulate the father into making a scene at this public restaurant at the end. So she does a really good twist in the story where you're down a certain path and then she flips the lid on the story in a way that's so interesting, because in that story you're in the headspace of the father and the interactions they're having at the dinner table, and then the way that they're making a scene, and he at the end of the story says, and I look like the arsehole now, I look like the bad guy. But obviously we've read the beginning of the story where the son has done the bad thing and he's getting suspended and he's the one that we're wary of in the story. So her sense of perspective and characters and really getting into those intimate relationships between the two characters or multiple characters that she is exposing us to in those stories, very powerful, very, very controlled, the way that she was doing it. I would happily reread those stories because they are out of recent story collections. They are very much imprinted on my brain, and I just loved her style. I loved the style of the stories. I loved her clever flipping of the stories, and they feel like very psychologically driven stories. So I ended up giving it, I think, around 4.5, and then we're getting there. There's just 3 more, guys. So the next one I read after that was Animal by Lisa Taddeo, and this was also a NetGalley proof. And I was really looking forward to this book because I really wanted to give Lisa Taddeo another try. I had read 3 Women a while back and was very, very dissatisfied with that book. I just found it completely sold wrong. I think the exploitative nature of that book was just frustrating for me. This had a lot more promise because I think my main feedback coming out of 3 Women was that I think she can really write, and I think that fiction might be well suited to her because she really had a very overactive imagination of these 3 women's experiences, considering these were real life people and she was kind of taking their stories from them. It felt more like she'd kind of fictionalised a lot of that and ad-libbed and got a bit carried away with herself, so I thought a fiction would be very well suited to her. One thing that I found particularly interesting for me with this book is that 3 Women was almost sold as a celebration of women's desire, and it was meant to be empowering for women, and the 3 stories chosen did no justice to that kind of narrative and that kind of message that Lisa Taddeo wanted to get across, because one was a woman who had had a sexually abusive relationship with a man. She was a minor. It was wrong on so many levels, and that was her main relationship with a man that kind of defined her life, and that the trauma meant she couldn't have a satisfying relationship with men going forward. One met a childhood sweetheart again who just exploited her, and she started having an affair with him. And the third one, she ended up sleeping with other people and videoing herself and sending it to her husband for his sexual gratification. So none of those, to me, were empowering scenarios for women. But then this book kind of takes on a different ethos, which is that men are all bastards and exploitative, and they all harm women, and everything is to the detriment of women that men do. They're all pigs and disgusting and abhorrent, and she has spent her life manipulating men now to get back for the fact that men are shit. She is very degraded, and I think the tagline is she's depraved. That's how she describes herself, this character. So Joan moves to this new area because a man that she was seeing, she sees a lot of men at the same time, and she ends up moving to this new place because a man that she was seeing, at the time she was seeing this other guy, she was in a diner with another guy that she was in love with, but the other guy that she was living with turns up and he shoots himself in the head in this public restaurant, and she wants to get away from the situation. In the meantime, the wife of the man that's died starts harassing her with texts, and his daughter comes to find her and wants to enact revenge for she's the reason he was so heartbroken he killed himself, because of her. Joan is a very, very unlikable character. She manipulates men. She has one strong female friendship relationship that she destroys on purpose in the book by sleeping with the person that she's interested in. There is some ridiculous scenes that I can't really talk about because they would spoil the book for people. But this particular book felt like Lisa Taddeo went out to shock you, and maybe she thinks it's empowering to write about female characters like this that are depraved, that have more characteristics of what we would typically deem as men. She goes out and sleeps with men that she wants to, and she has power and control, and she's selfish, and she's dark, and I don't know what the intention was, but this book was all over the place for me. The plot didn't make any sense. The justifications for how Joan's behaviour did not make sense. The relationship she has with the guy, the elderly man who rents out the place to her, didn't make any sense to me. That made me hugely uncomfortable. The scenes that happen later on in the book in regards to that, I was not happy with this book at all. I think maybe once the dust settles it might be good for me to do a proper review, because I can already tell that people will probably watch this and just have no concept of what I'm talking about. But it's a lot of the things that annoy me are plot points or things that Joan does or actual segments in the book, so I don't want to spoil that for people, especially because this book is coming out. So suffice to say, I think I gave it between 1.5 and maybe 2 if I was generous. Did not like this book. That was that. And then I read Saint X by Alexis Shaitkin, and this was a NetGalley book as well. So this is kind of a murder mystery about a character, Alison, who goes missing on holiday in the 90s, and she's on holiday in the fictional island of Saint X. So on the surface that's what this story is about, but it kind of is from the point of view of Clary, who is Alison's sister, who becomes obsessed with this mystery. She's grown up her whole life in the shadow of this mystery. They did find Alison, she did die, but they don't know how. So Clary starts listening to Alison's old audio tape diaries, and she, in an act of coincidence, finds out that the taxi driver one day taking her to work is a man who she believed killed her sister and who lived in the island of Saint X. And then the story kind of goes from there. I don't want to spoil it too much. I think Clary was an interesting character because she's the first kind of protagonist that has actively been written that I've read in a while as kind of odd and an outsider. And we kind of see from her perspective that she feels the same way about herself. And she was living a bit in Alison's shadow, and everyone kind of makes reference to the fact that Clary was different. And it kind of dissects Alison's character in a really interesting way because she was 18 or 19 when she died. She still has that veneer of immaturity that does get addressed by Clary and Alison's diary and from all the characters' perspectives as well. So it was interesting because there wasn't a glorification of the victim. I think Clary had this complicated relationship because she was quite young. There's a bit of an age gap between the two of them, so she really didn't have any sense of who her sister was, and she was trying to piece that together. And as she got to an age where she outlived her sister in years, she found that more complicated, trying to analyse who her sister was with the reality of her age and other things like that. I found it quite interesting. Some bits I just didn't enjoy as much as others, so overall I thought it was a good plot. Very strong writing. I liked the holiday angle. I liked the way that the mystery played out, and the reveal was satisfying to me, so I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, that one. And then I read Burnt Sugar by Avni Doshi. This is the last book, I promise. And I found this disappointing. The first few chapters that I read it, I said to myself, oh, I can understand why this was on the Man Booker Prize list, because it is very beautifully written. But then there was huge chunks of this book, and considering this book is around 250 pages, it's not long. There was huge chunks of the story I was bored with. There's a section in the book where it talks about when they live in an ashram and her mother joins this kind of religious cult-like environment where she is obsessed with this leader who she starts an intimate relationship with, and she brings her daughter along for the ride, and there's a lot of resentment there. Her daughter has felt a lot of childhood trauma about this incident where she was neglected by her mum, who prioritised the cult religious group, I don't know what you want to call it, but an extreme group. And so she feels a lot of abandonment from that. But we go into a lot of detail of her time there. That was just very dull. We were having a lot of descriptions about people's clothing that they were wearing, whether it was white or black, and her mother in the other room, and feelings and like floaty language, and the plot was just like barely moving, like just not like at all. The ending felt a little bit rushed and a little bit surreal at the end. It's like it got to a part where the daughter was having a baby, and from the idea of she thought she might want a baby with her husband to having the baby, and then the final ending was just very like, oh, now we're just going a little bit too fast now. We've had a chunk of very slow, and then we've just raced to the end. I think relationships between mothers and daughters is a really hot topic in literature at the moment. Transcendent Kingdom was similar. I don't think this was done very well. I could feel the tension between these two characters, and her mother was very cruel, and she was full of resentment. But the story didn't go anywhere. So for me, it was like, okay, you've set all of this up, this is what this book's going to address, but it wasn't done in a compelling way. There was nothing narratively significant about this story. It was kernels in this book of really interesting things to say, but padded by a lot of things that to me weren't interesting to fill the book out, which didn't work for me. So I ended up giving it 2 out of 5 stars. So thank you so much if you've stayed to the end and watched this video, because it's ridiculously long. But I'll be back very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.